G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and a fantastic Monday. Now happily this is the last Monday of 2024. I'm unsure if you're like me, but I cannot believe that tomorrow is New Year's Eve and that we're at the end of another year. Now, earlier in the year, I made a video on some predictions of what we would see over the course of this year. So I will be going over that and seeing where I was correct and incorrect. And I'll be making another video at some point in the next few days, giving my predictions short, medium, and long term on what we will see in this war, and maybe as far as geopolitics on a larger degree, because this war, at the end of the day, this is still isolated between Ukraine and Russia. But of course, Ukraine has all the support of the Western states. Russia has the support of countries that the West is coining the axis of upheaval: Iran, North Korea, and China. And we are in what I'm calling the second Cold War, or the third world war that is just very quiet potentially now, or maybe it will always be quiet, but in a series of proxy wars. So we'll go over that. Now, one thing I need to say as a bit of housekeeping at the beginning of this video is there's going to be a lot of information presented, but at different points throughout this video. Now, this isn't a tactic to try and make you stick around for longer. It's because I'll be presenting parts that are strategic, parts that are politics, parts that are tactical, and that these all are one in the same in the war. They all relative to each other. They're not mutually exclusive, but has to be presented at different points. We will be going back and forth between bits and pieces as well. Remember, there are multiple fronts on this war. There is the front line, the battle. There is then the energy front line that is being fought not only with Russia, but also now with some European Union NATO states as well, particularly Slovakia. Then there's the information war. Then there is the hybrid, unconventional, unrestricted, whatever you want to call it, that level of war, potentially with false flags in it too. So we'll be going over all of this. Yesterday we spoke about how some people are not seeing the forest through the trees, and we're going to be going over something very similar to this from experts to do with military actions, talking about why would Putin negotiate and how to bring Putin to the negotiating table. We're going to go over that, and we're also going to look at what some of my friends, experts in their fields but private, are saying about this war to do with movement to the Dnieper River, North Koreans, as well as why would Putin negotiate, and of course escalation. We're going to talk about that and see where things are being missed. Of course, we need to go over the plane that has crashed in Kazakhstan, where some are saying, is this an accident? Is it targeted? Is it a false flag? Is there relation to other aircraft that have had failures recently as well? We'll look at how Slovakia see the end of the war. I have a miscellaneous folder just with some weapons and some other bits and pieces in it. And of course, I'll present the maps and the piece that I missed yesterday about the Ursa Major. Of course, that ship carrying parts for Russian icebreakers. We are saying that Russia is the Arctic power. China is a developing Arctic power, but that's where Russia hold a lot of power. And we have said for months and months, Russia's icebreaker fleet is a big threat, same as their nuclear propulsion technology to go with those and the emission standards around the Arctic. So we'll go over that. And then a few weeks ago, we said if a Russian ship was to get into trouble right here, just to the west of the Gibraltar, this would be the worst possible location due to the sanctions put on Russian fleets and where Spain and NATO sits in here. Where did that ship go down? Right there. What was it carrying? Then parts for nuclear reactors aboard that are to go aboard icebreakers. And I have a bit more information about this. But yesterday, something we were told about is people that are, I think, may internally know the truth, but won't present the truth as maybe they see it in behind closed doors because they don't want to, and it's very hard to change your mind. Criticism, self-examination, all of this. And I've been reading Gad Sad's The Parasitic Mind, his new book. The quest for truth should always supersede one's ego-defensive desire to be proven right. This is not an easy task because for most people, it is difficult to admit to being wrong. And this is where I see some very smart people, some experienced people pushing narratives. I'm going, I know, or some people I know because I know them, don't believe this, and others, I don't believe they believe it, but they're ignoring whole parts to push on something else and are caught in that propaganda informational sphere, or way too ways with their ego defensive biases too. Now, let's start at the Ursa Major. Now, I presented last time that I spoke to one of my friends that has worked in demolitions, underwater demolitions, operations around this previously. And he said, look, I've done a bit of this. I'll reach out to someone else who's got far more knowledge than I internationally, but it's going to be a few days to hear back. Now, when he says my mate, mates, but this isn't just one of the boys down at the pub sharing their opinion. My mate believes that tanker was hit by a manually placed device while in port. Could have been a landmine with an improvised fusing, a proper limpet mine, or even improvised. So improvised, then mine too, and fusing. It was smart to wait until it was at sea to detonate, so the ship sunk. What we haven't seen and what I would love to see, but now it's on the bottom of the ocean. So if Steven Seagal wants to put on his scuba kit, dive down and take a photo in between him blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, I'd like to see the explosion, because the telltale sign from these guys doing it is they say it will look like a tear going inwards rather than a hole going outwards if it was in the engine room aboard the ship. So again, we haven't seen any photos of that. That to me is suspicious as well, but some very important pieces, including the ship, went down with that. So let's have a look at my miscellaneous folder, then we'll have a look at the maps, and then we'll go over this Putin negotiation, and then we'll do the plane crash in that order. So Ukrainian UGV, these are ground-based drones, domestically produced. You can see several of them here. Looks like they are brand new. We have seen both tracked and wheeled variants of this participating in combat before. Nowhere near in the numbers we have seen, of course, UAVs, but there is definitely a place for these, and I think we'll see an increase in these as the front lines and the fortifications are so difficult to move anywhere at the moment. Now, we are expecting a large US aid package to be released in the coming days. This is from a speech by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. An important decision from the US in support of Ukraine is being prepared. We expect official announcement as soon as tomorrow. Significant aid packages for our warriors. This support is aimed at strengthening stabilization efforts on the front lines right now. Okay, great. More weapons, more ammo, but what is just completely being ignored, and we're going to go through this as well, is guys at the front line are saying, yes, there's a weapons and ammo shortage, but the manpower shortage is just as acute. But that is, of course, being massively, massively ignored. And when we go over what could occur in negotiations, that I think is going to be one of the biggest pieces that if Russia come to the table, which Sergei Lavrov, Minister of Foreign Affairs, has said, we're not going to bother coming to the table, and I'll present that as well today. But if there is a table sitting, it's going to go, well, we don't care about the weapons because you can send it whoever you want. You still need someone on the back end of that system or on that trigger. Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andriy Sybiha, has said this about Russian LNG, liquid natural gas, going to the EU, saying there should be a ban on this. The head of Foreign Ministry reacted to the publication of Financial Times that during 2024, EU countries imported a record volume of Russian LNG. This is unacceptable. Imports of Russian LNG to the EU should be banned as part of further sanctions and replaced by supplies from the US and other partners. And this goes directly into what I say about EU, NATO. Western rhetoric about Ukraine is far different from the actions of which are taken. The rhetoric is that this war is existential, not only for Ukraine, because it is, but it's existential for the entire West and NATO, but continue to do things like this, as well as drag feed on other areas. So what I say is the rhetoric versus the reality, there is a big difference in this. There is enough liquefied natural gas on the market not to finance the criminal Russian regime along with its aggression, war crimes, and hybrid attacks. That said, it is significantly more expensive. We saw the first shipment of LNG from the US to Ukraine yesterday, and some are saying that is about 5 times the cost, and that is why some are saying Slovakia is pushing back so hard against this. Now, there's been a lot of rumors that Russia has captured a Ukrainian Air Force pilot, although the Ukrainian Air Force has denied this, but it's not super clear. So TASS, a Russian news agency, has come out and said a Ukrainian pilot, Vladimir Popovich, has surrendered in the embattled Russian region of Kursk. But the Air Force has said, unfortunately, cases of capture of military personnel who previously served in the Air Force do occur. However, the information about the capture of a Ukrainian pilot is false. All Ukrainian pilots continue to perform tasks to protect the country. The Air Force did not provide further details nor name Popovich specifically. It is unclear whether the Air Force was refuting that Popovich was captured or that he was an active pilot at the time of his alleged capture. So they're not saying that someone wasn't captured, they're saying that a pilot wasn't captured. And they say here, training new pilots is lengthy and expensive process, making aviators especially valuable personnel. But yes, Ukraine does have too a finite number of fighter aircraft. And like we are seeing that air defense staff are being moved into infantry and frontline positions, we could see then ex-pilots then moved into infantry roles as well, because there is a finite amount of aircraft. The new aircraft going into Ukraine are Western F-16s, planes like this, rather than the Soviet MiG-29s or other aircraft like this. Finite amount of them. If they stop flying, these pilots, they could be shifted here. And it hasn't been very clear what exactly has actually occurred here, saying that it is misinformation, but servicemen who previously served in the Air Force do occur. So it sounds like potentially someone was, but wasn't a pilot at the time. Again, there is a propaganda informational war going on, so we will wait until we have any further confirmation on that. We've about as much evidence of that as the North Koreans at this point in time. So let's have a look at the maps and see what some others are saying to me as well. So of course, this is Ukraine in the center, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 2022, the purple since 2014. On the map today, the red check, that shows ground that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. Now, of course, this is the Dnieper River running basically north to south through Ukraine, right where my cursor is going at the moment. Now, some have said if the war was to end right now, that the border would be here. Others have said no, Russia will not stop until there is some physical border, and that physical border could be the Dnieper River. Of course, Alex from History Legends, he spoke about this in his interview. This is one of the points that we disagreed on. But let's have a look at this. This is from another AUSINT helper of mine, back end, not public. Alex from History Legends is saying the same thing that a couple of people, mutuals here, said when this all started. The Dnieper is the most prominent geographic boundary, and it's where we say this war is ending. That holding the west bank of that river would be a victory in itself, as opposed to complete annihilation. So saying if Ukraine can just hold the west bank, even from the start, they think that was a victory. Very experienced guys. He is saying this. Anyway, in terms of geography, the Dnieper makes sense. Personally, if I was Ukraine, I would have dug a fucking ditch, a big fucking ditch from Dnipro to Kharkiv, and from Kharkiv through the swamps to the north and back to the Dnieper. It's funny how a hard physical feature like that can change people's psychological understanding of space and can delineate a boundary clearly. Much easier to negotiate around that line too. Setting up a demilitarized zone between the line and the border meets one of Russia's terms, a clear concession, which requires concessions in return. Remember, negotiation, concession, I think people may need to look in a dictionary and see that those are two-way streets. The loss of everything east of that line is a blow to the economy of Ukraine, but can they hold it? No, he doesn't believe that Ukraine can hold to the east of wherever that line would be or currently, and we're seeing that the border is moving west. Can they rebuild it? Not without further concessions to Western backers like BlackRock and foreign governments who then impose their will and ideals on Ukraine. So for how expensive this is going to be, these semi-private public companies are going to come in and change how things are going to look as well. So thank you for seeing that across. He knows who he is. Now, talking up in Kursk, let's have a look, as there was by Surak Maps a Ukrainian advancement in Kursk today, of course, where the North Korean soldiers are allegedly fighting. So if we have a look, it's just in this sector right about here. Ukrainian army recaptured some positions east of the village in here. Again, this is very, very hard because the labeling on this map is so difficult to see. Well, it's non-existent. But of course, this is where people say that the North Koreans are fighting, and that Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has said that over 3,000 have been killed or wounded. But then everyone else says there's 12,000 there. Well, if it was 12,000 beginning, at least stick with the same propaganda narrative and say that there's now 9,000 remaining. But let's have a look at this. So your points on the North Koreans are solid. I've no doubt they're in South Russia, which I say as well. But everybody's asking what makes sense for Russia or Ukraine. Nobody's asking what makes sense for North Korea. Sending waves of men to die in Russia doesn't make sense. Sending artillery crews does make sense. The border between Korea is, or between the two Koreas, South and North, is lined with artillery, and in the coming reunification war will be very artillery heavy. This is something we have spoken about from some other information that I was sent, saying that the North Korean self-propelled guns that are coming in are going to have North Korean crews because the Russians don't want to train large crews to operate those guns. Russia has enough guns and it's a different caliber of ammunition anyway. So that makes sense. Sending engineer teams makes sense. We also spoke about this ages back about North Korean engineers entering the war. The border, so between South and North, is a massive minefield that must be breached, and those teams need experience under war conditions. Sending special forces and officer cadres as observers near the front makes sense. They will have long careers, that's if they don't fuck up, and will likely be involved in running the reunification war. The enlisted conscripted class are not so important to gain experience as they won't be expected to last long or have long careers. So you send your observers, your elite, your artillery, your engineers to get that experience to then disseminate back home rather than at the front here for what they could see, North Korea may see reunification war. Getting experience in those areas makes sense for North Korea and frees up Russia's need to backfill those roles with trained crews. And this is what we spoke about, and I spoke about this probably a year ago when people were laughing at North Korean engineers going in. I'm saying, but if one North Korean can replace one Russian engineer, and they can move to other areas, that is still very, very important to this war as a whole. So take that as you will. Still waiting on super concrete evidence of North Koreans operating en masse in Kursk. There is some little bits and pieces of evidence. Would I believe that would hold up in a court of law beyond reasonable doubt? I personally do not believe so. I believe there are North Koreans operating here, but to say that 3,000 have been killed or wounded with none then captured and saying that the ones we could have captured couldn't be resuscitated and there's no evidence, I'm sorry, it doesn't line up. Even if 0.1% were then taken as prisoner from 3,000, you'd think someone would have survived that. It seems a bit too convenient, especially for how there can be incentive for this. So let's have a look. We'll come down on this map, of course, the red check, you know what you're looking at. It's where Russia has moved. So we see this just to the west of Pokrovsk and Minograd, to the east, we see there is some red check in here. And this is then confirmed by Syriac map showing that Russians had an advancement here as well. So we can confirm that definitely occurred. We'll come down Pokrovsk front line. You can see the red check towards Uspanivka and to where I won't try and pronounce here. Of course, making this spire coming out fatter and fatter, meaning it's more and more difficult to cut off. So we see here, again, this map, Uspanivka, this area, which I can't pronounce, but again, looking very, very similar. So we can confirm those advances definitely took place. Then we'll come down Kurakhove, Sarytony, Shevchenko, where the Russian forces are moving further and further west. Other maps will show from Sontnivska to Sarytony that this then pocket has been closed up as well. Let's show this. Now, Syriac P is showing that this pocket has closed up and that the Russian forces are moving further towards Shevchenko and, of course, occupying the majority of the center of Kurakhove, more so than this map is showing at this point in time. We also showed some geolocations yesterday that prove this to be different as well. But no other movements down in the south. Ignore just some of the red and green lines on that. It's just where some frontline areas are moving. We see then Toretsk, Nelipivkia. So this is interesting because we did say this map has not shown what other maps are showing of Russian advancement near Leninivkia, Petrivkia. What we can see is this map is showing movement down this railway here. Now remember, a lot of maps show this a lot further, but it is showing some movement in here as well as to the south of the center of Toretsk, when there's a lot of fighting and it's hard to get an idea exactly where the border is sitting in there. Come into Chasiv Yar. Now, just to the north, we do see further Russian advancement as well. Other maps are showing that Ukraine had a offensive in the center of Chasiv Yar here, not shown on this map and also not shown on Syriac maps. So give it a couple of days and we will see what the situation is there. But as you can see, up in this north sector right in here, we can confirm that there was definitely some advancement there. Both maps are showing it, but the difference is in the center of Chasiv Yar. During the last days, Russian army managed to capture most of Hirovkia after weeks of positional battles, and in addition in the north. So not showing that on this map, both maps not showing that there was a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive there either, like others are claiming. Again, wait out on that. I'll try and get more information. Of course, we come up and then we have Terny right where my cursor is, having a look here. and said that there are then further Russian advancements down to the tree lines in here. So this is a fair bit different. See where this then bridge is? This is this bridge right here. So it is right here. So this map from Suryak to this map is showing some, say, 2 kilometers as the crow flies. Different, but weighed out on that. We know there has been a lot of back and forward fighting around Terni. So let's go over this. Why would Putin negotiate? And if he does negotiate, well, if we want to get Putin to negotiate, how do we do that? How does the West, how does NATO get Putin to negotiate? What position do then we need Ukraine in? How do we get to that? But also, there's some things in there that are just bloody ignored. Something you need to remember before we go into this is Putin's one constant throughout the war has been Ukraine not joining NATO, either by agreement, by diplomatic means, or by demilitarization, one or the other. That the goalposts have shifted on territory and other things, but the one constant has been not joining NATO. And a lot of this goes into then escalation, something I want to share before we get into this. I think the main reason for Russians not escalating further as a response to missile strikes on Russian land, aside from the fact that there aren't many of them, so realistically how many attackers and storm shadows are going in, not that many, is that Trump is clearly opposed to Ukraine doing this. So they may have figured out that it's easier to just wait a few weeks for Trump to call them off and not escalate, because then Western escalation into Ukraine or weapons, whatever, could go further as well. Sort of just continuing that grind as way, waiting for then President-elect Donald Trump to come in. So let's have a look at this. So this is from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. This is titled, Putin Thinks He Can Win. Why would he negotiate? From the beginning, Russian President Vladimir Putin believed he would win this war. Russian soldiers brought parade uniforms to the fight, not winter gear. He says he believed, but I'll say we believe, because this is where this actually comes from, that he would be in Kiev in 3 days. Again, that is from intelligence assessments outside of the Kremlin as well. That's where the 3 days really comes from. I think everyone believed this. Everyone was surprised at the passion, the ferocity that the Ukrainian soldiers fought back and were able to push the Russians back and hold ground, especially in those beginning weeks and months. But don't just say he believed this. Everyone believed if Russia had a full-scale invasion that this is what would happen. It has been 3 years, not 3 days. But Putin still believes he can win on the battlefield. That belief will severely slow potential negotiations as long as Putin thinks fighting benefits him. He has little incentive to make a deal. US and European allies must change this calculus and change it quickly. Specifically, Western nations must signal that military assistance will accelerate in volume and capability the longer the fighting goes on. This will raise the cost of Putin's equation to the point that Russia comes to the table with an incentive to negotiate. Again, the same we're hearing again and again. We need to bring Putin to the table, but he's on the back foot, Ukraine in a position of power. And to do that quickly is just not possible. Is it possible at all? Well, we don't know. But firstly, I thought that we're all being told that Russia is collapsing. Now we're being told it's not. They're continuing. We need to push here. So that blows a lot of that propaganda out of the water straight away. But secondly, if I was assessing the war, I would put the primary issue for Ukraine at this point in time is manpower. Weapons, aid, military assistance, this will of course increase the cost for the Russian armed forces. Of course it will. But what you are forgetting is that these weapons, these systems, if it's an F-16 to an AK to an M4 to whatever, on the back end of that, or in the cockpit or on the trigger, you need motivated, competent people to be operating these systems. And that's why I put manpower is the biggest issue. There are weapons issues, there are aid issues, but the manpower issue is just completely ignored by all levels, including these that should be seeing this. And I believe that the Kremlin is assessing this the same way. They say Russia comes to the table with incentive. And I believe the time to have Russia come to the table with incentive, this was back in 2022, before the war was seen as existential for Russia that was the point, to have mass mobilizations in Ukraine, potentially even deploy NATO in when Russia was on the back foot, and would have been easier to sell a special military operation limited victory there, rather than what we are seeing now, as Russia has taken a long time, but it has stood up and is having military victories all over the front line for now over 12 months. So when negotiations work, historically, wars end with either a complete military victory, a ceasefire, or negotiated peace settlement. According to the Hague Centre for Strategic Studies, only 16% of wars between 1946 and 2005 have ended in negotiated solution. Among these peace settlements, 37% led to renewed conflict, often within just 2 years. Negotiations tend to be most successful when parties establish a baseline of trust and address the root causes of the conflict. The root cause of the conflict is joining NATO, and neither side is going to budge on this, because Ukraine is saying, if we don't join NATO, we are left out on our own, we don't have security guarantees, and Russia will just invade again at some point. Russia is saying, if Ukraine is in NATO and NATO moves up here, this is existential. It's a problem for our security of the state. Neither side is going to budge on this, but that is the root cause of this. This is why, at the end of the day, people say territory. That was part of, like I've said, I believe that Putin said, no, we're going in, whether there's an agreement to not join NATO, demilitarization, and going into this of a complete military victory. But that is the thing that has been constant, is NATO. So we can't step around that fact. I'm not saying that Ukraine shouldn't join NATO, but we need to be realistic about that. Putin will continue this war, I believe, as long as Ukraine is looking to join NATO. But if Ukraine doesn't join NATO, well, what future does it have for security from there? Critical to any negotiation is the parties want to be there. So they want to be at the negotiating table. Negotiation theories describes this concept as BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. BATNA, best alternative negotiated agreement. In other words, if talks fail, what happens? If both sides think a return to fighting hurts their interests, the odds improve for a negotiated settlement. If, on the one hand, at least one party believes the fight is trending in their favour and they believe they can sustain that fight for some time, the incentive structure flips. It makes more sense to keep fighting. And they correctly point out here that Putin is in the latter category. He believes that they can sustain fighting and the fight is trending in their favour. And given the current trends, here they say he is not wrong. Russia has played to type in this war. Just like in past conflicts from World War II, the Winter War, Moscow has been willing to sacrifice stomach-turning quantities of men to achieve incremental gains. And we've seen this throughout war, and this is why you can't add Western NATO standards of fighting onto the Russian forces. A complete different strategy, different doctrine around recruitment, around how to fight too. So where collapse one may not on other sectors as well. It's thrown hardened soldiers and conscripts alike into a meat grinder to make minuscule territorial gains or to hold strategically pointless positions. There has been definitely in protracted attritional war, strategically very important positions fall. Again, things become strategically pointless as soon as the narrative shifts, but also the territorial gains, they're not minuscule either. You're talking hundreds of square kilometres a month. And eventually you chip away, things are going to start collapsing much further. But over time, those gains have added up. And those defensive positions have been dug in deeply. Russia's deep bench of men and material gives Moscow staying power. Now, given these factors though, which country is more likely to collapse first, militarily and economically as well? What is coming first, a Russian economic collapse or a Ukrainian military collapse? And that is the calculation that those in Kyiv and those in the Kremlin and those in Washington will be making as well. And if you were to ask me that question, I would say I think a collapse of the Ukrainian front lines militarily is closer than an economic collapse of the Russian system. The level of sacrifice Russia is willing to make should concern those who are fighting at the front line or negotiating as well. Russia see this war as existential for the Russian Federation. So does Ukraine. Both these countries are willing to make massive sacrifices, but numerically there are very different figures thrown around. Meanwhile, US and European governments have slowly dripped resources into Ukraine. The aid has been enough to keep the Ukrainian patient alive, but not enough to decisively shift the balance toward victory. Putin has successfully convinced Washington that he is to be feared and that he is crazy enough to drag NATO into war. Allies have let their fear and escalation overtake a winning military strategy. I believe that NATO and Washington have convinced themselves that Russia is on its way to storm and go back through Berlin. There is no indication of this, nor does Russia hold the military power conventionally to do this. I think there's been some self-convincing here to justify other means rather than what is said and what the military power actually is. And Putin's saber-rattling is to scare people. It is a form of fear-mongering. It's a form of propaganda. There's propaganda everywhere, but it's also in to show how important that he sees his war in Ukraine to be, as well, of course, this existential war. We'll continue. Why talk when Russia thinks it can win? Assuming the Allies continue to support Ukraine at this slow drip, when the Trump administration asked Putin to sit down for peace talks in January, he's likely to slow roll an answer. He will have no incentive to sit or hurry at all. That's if he even bothers coming. Because if we look at what Sergei Lavrov has said when he spoke to Russian media today, Moscow will neither take part in a peace summit nor follow Vladimir Zelensky's statements. Lavrov saying it is impossible to guess what Zelensky's public admission of his inability to regain lost territories by force means. Zelensky keeps making various statements all the time. We have stopped paying attention to them. Frankly speaking, we do not believe statements, but rather facts, especially when it comes to the Kiev regime. I've repeatedly emphasised that we're not going to participate in the peace summit, even if we receive an invitation. And this is where I think people need to get out of their head. People just have this idea that if an invitation is sent to Russia, automatically they will come to the table. My question is, why at this point would they come to that table? The stick is not working. The carrot, US, Ukraine, the EU is not going to hang a carrot out there. I believe the war is very likely to continue. Or if the Trump administration does sign a deal, I struggle to believe how far that deal would have to be in Russia's favour, with Russia having the upper hand on the battlefield at this point in time. But at this point, if the war then continues, then what does Ukraine do? What does NATO do? When Zelensky himself has said that Ukraine doesn't have the power militarily to return those grounds, that it will be done diplomatically. But what happens if Russia's not willing to do it diplomatically and say we're just going to continue the war? Then this goes into not calling up men because you can believe you can do it diplomatically. What if then you need those men and they haven't been called up? Now, here is a bit where it gets a bit lost. He cares not a bit whether more Russians nor North Koreans die for his territorial ambitions. Now, again, the ambition for territory is not as constant as it has been for Ukraine not joining NATO. And we've seen this with what has been put forward from the negotiations in Turkey, what was offered earlier this year as well. The territory, the goalposts have shifted on that. For Russia, not for Ukraine, but it's always been about NATO. So saying that this is just imperialistic territorial ambition is also incorrect. He likely assesses, and I believe correctly, that the US and Europe's generosity with Ukraine is waning, and it is. And people in these countries too are starting to question more and more of why. People in Ukraine are starting to question more and more on the continuation of the war too. It's been a long, bloody, costly war. He will see the time is on his side. He fights on. Zelensky loses more men, and Trump, eager to see his campaign promise fulfilled, cranks up the pressure. This is the thing, is Putin might see that I can undermine Trump's presidency to a degree as well by not letting what he has promised his followers come true. Ukraine cannot survive negotiations under those conditions. Putin will demand and likely receive territorial concessions. No, Putin will be after Ukraine not joining NATO more so than territorial concessions. Crimea and Donbass are guaranteed casualties at this point in time under negotiations. Even if Zelensky plays a weak hand brilliantly, he cannot ignore that his nation is increasingly fighting on fumes. Again though, what this article doesn't mention fucking once is it mentions Western military aid. It does not mention that the recruitment and the mobilization, that is running on fumes as well. I don't know why. Well, I do know why this is being ignored. It is because it's a hard truth that has to look internally, that can be very difficult to do That's why I showed what I showed right at the beginning of the video with that quote. Putin, on the other hand, has choices. He can either fight until he has the outcome, not the territory. He wants the outcome. He wants the outcome he wants is Ukraine not joining NATO, not exactly just territory. I believe the territory is in a state of flux. He wants Crimea, he wants Donbass, but other areas, I believe, are still up in the air if NATO is agreed for not entry there. Or he can send negotiators to draw out talks for years, while Zelensky's partner is lost allies and creeping military defeat. Putin's in a grinding war of attrition that he's highly likely to win. As he sits in the Kremlin, that option looks pretty good. And this is the thing, that even this is saying that he's highly likely to win it. Why and how then are you going to get him to the table and then the best possible outcome? And what I say in this is, Ukraine has not mobilised enough men for the war to continue or to stabilise the front lines or win it back even more. This is the problem. I think that Kyiv is banking on Russia wanting to negotiate and being willing to negotiate. But what if they're not and you haven't mobilised enough men and it's going to take 12 to 18 months for those mobilised troops to ever show up at the front line? You're better off having mobilised men, trained men that you do not need, rather than not having them and then needing them. And dragging the feet on mobilisation, lowering mobilisation age, conscription age, that has led to an acute shortage of men at the front line. And to fix that is a minimum of 12 to 18 months if it can be fixed. And I think there's this banking on, don't worry, Russia will negotiate. But then if they don't negotiate and you've got no men sitting there, what's Ukraine going to do and what is NATO going to do? It's going to be very difficult to get Putin to the negotiating table. Zelensky says you need to do it by force. Okay, that is the stick. The stick is currently not working. No one, especially Zelensky, is going to be willing to do it by carrot. The clock ticks for everyone. The US and Europe can flip this script by making clear that Putin's future options are worsening, not improving. That will require resolve and turning the current IV drip of aid into a stream, into a raging river. My question again, though, is who is firing these weapons? Who is training on them? There's going to be tens to hundreds of thousands more people needed, as positions at the front line are already empty, and battalions, divisions, companies are definitely still short on numbers. The threat is the delivery of weapons Ukraine needs to win, increasing numbers and lethality as the months tick on. The Trump administration should send this threat as they send an influx of air defense interceptors and a whole bunch of other military equipment. But again, I ask, you're still not pointing at who's operating these systems. What is the availability of things like air defense missiles? How many can be sent? How long is the training time? You talk about F-16s. It takes years for people to be trained on these, and these so far have had no tangible difference in the war. And what we're being told from guys at the front is infantry is what is needed. And I've spoken on this again and again, that there's been so much so many people vocal and so much effort put into these like more attractive, sexy weapons of look at this gun or look at this plane or look at that, while being ignored, there's a fly around me, what's being ignored is infantry at the front line, night vision, radios, simple things like that. And many people are not happy about this at the front line. The stakes go up every month. Russia neglects to sign a deal, so more military aid will be going in. Economic sanctions should follow a similar path. But what I say in this is, yes, stakes go up, these systems going in. But what we are being told from Ukrainian military at the front is that even like these air defense, that they're, because the manpower shortage is so desperate at the front line, guys are coming off these air defense batteries that have been trained in the West to go into the infantry. So all this can become useless if you don't fix the manpower issue at the front line. And I believe that how the Kremlin is assessing this, going, we don't really care what is sent in, because manpower is the issue, and whatever is sent is it will have an effect in the beginning, but it's not ever going to be sent on enough numbers or with enough trained personnel and in line combined arms with infantry to make a huge difference. It'll make it more costly, but will it absolutely change the tide? I believe that their calculus is saying no, it is not. And at this point in the time, I don't think that it would either. Economic sanctions should follow a similar path. Good faith negotiations result in limited sanctions relief. So you negotiate will give you some relief here as well. But like I say here, which there's secondary and primary issues. the fortifications, night vision, manpower, that's the primary. Secondary issue is getting more advanced systems in, but we only focus on one. And those sanctions, they will only last for so long. The longer sanctions are in place, the less and less effect they'll have. They sort of start slow, they peak, and then they start tapering off as other markets are found. Putin himself may not want to give his people the relief of peace, but his advisors and the oligarchs whose businesses have suffered as a result of this war are more reachable. Now, in the interview with the economic expert, he had basically said, no, these oligarchs you speak of who may be more reachable, the Kremlin knows this, and what they'll do is they will subsidise these oligarchs out of state money so they're not as turned away. They must believe the picture is getting worse for Moscow, not better. Economic sanctions will continue to bite their bank accounts, but what he's saying is the Kremlin will basically just subsidise this. More importantly, they need to fear their own population. They must believe that the Russian people will not stomach Ukrainian forces occupying Kursk. Again, it's 480 squares. It's important, but it's so much less important than people are, so much less relevant than people are making out. Talking about North Koreans here operating on Russian soil. Perhaps most importantly, they need to believe their sons are next on the call-up sheet. I ask then, when was the last mobilisation? Currently, Russia is meeting or beyond replacement of just volunteers. A lot of money being thrown there, but it's not on the call-up sheet. It is currently volunteers. Now, that will require an aggressive and clever information operation, perhaps run by those on Russia's doorstep, such as the Poles, the Finns and the Estonians. So saying this enforcement of conscription coming to an end to change this narrative by running these information operations. What I'll say is, these information operations, these are running and have run for years, things like NAFO and other bits and pieces. And for the first, say, 2 years, they were very, very successful. But now, as we see that situation deteriorating and some of that propaganda information operation starting to fall apart, I believe it's actually backfiring and currently having a negative effect. The cost of forced peace. The temptation to obtain peace at any cost is seductive. Trump has a measly few years to cement his legacy. Putin likely has a decade or more in office. I won't talk on this at this point in time. Of course, I like living in a democratic capitalist society. You probably know this if you watch me. But as far as war, this is where more authoritarian states can have an upper hand. Is the leader, whether it is Putin, Xi Jinping, whoever, that they know they're going to be in power and can make decisions much, much further on, not restricted to a few years. Now, I don't want to live in that system, but this is why we have, of course, martial law, is to change into an authoritarian structure there so you can have more of a vertical command structure and you can make decisions without having to have then elections halfway through and can plan longer forward. It can help in times of war. It can also reduce the amount of creativity that your engineers and others can have. So there are pros and cons, as we have seen with then liberal democracy winning over fascism and communism, but in protracted war there are pros and cons here. I can speak on that at length if you would like. That Putin can afford to stall. Trump may want to just get things over with, give Putin what he wants, and force Zelensky into a weak peace as a rump state on the cold edge of Europe. But I believe that Putin is seeing that he can undermine Trump's promise to his own then supporters as well here by not letting him end the war. But as well in this, I believe whatever Putin would actually agree to, I can't see an American administration actually agreeing to that. I agree with Professor Mearsheimer's opinion on this. But my question is, what if Trump's advisors see that Ukraine has crossed the event horizon and that a victory is impossible and that they should seek the best deal possible? I think that is what Trump is looking at. That Trump isn't just, I want to end this war for being popular and this and that and give in to Kremlin propaganda. I think that he and his advisors are going, no matter what is given, this is on either a long or short term, but either way, it's either short or long to land concessions that we can end now and try and get a good deal, or it's going to carry on for years and it's probably going to get even worse. Again, this might go into my video about predictions for the future. That would be a mistake. First, while Trump says he wants to end wars, a peace secured by handing Ukraine to Russia would only make more wars likely. Again, doesn't really track potentially, but there's some BS in here too. What would make Putin stop at Ukraine once he's gotten a taste of empire building? Romania, Moldova, Georgia, and the Baltics might be next on the menu. Has this person who wrote this, who is the Director of Intelligence, National Security and Technical Program, the Vice President of Defence and Security Department in the Centre of Strategic and International Studies in Washington, has this person heard of NATO? Romania, Baltic, these are NATO countries. Same as why Putin first launched the war was to try and make it so either by agreement or by demilitarization that Ukraine never joins NATO. And you've just completely missed this. If Russia just wanted more land, there would be far easier countries to invade than Ukraine. Now, Crimea, Donbass, I completely get there was definitely wanting to grab bits of land there. But that is part of it. But another massive part is not wanting NATO there. You're not seeing the forest through the trees. Trump has said his ultimate goal is to increase pressure on China, giving in to Putin only emboldens Beijing in its own territorial and economic ambitions. A recovered victorious Russia can begin to turn its energies towards repaying its debt it owes China. So what they're saying is, if we give in to Putin, we're going to see Beijing make a move on Taiwan. I don't know if this is directly in line. Potentially, I believe if China was to make a move, it's probably in their interest to do it soon, while the West is the lowest it will be in arms for some time, because our factories and whatever haven't started churning up again, and things are very, very expensive with the massive inflation in the West, caused too by this war and by response to other things around the world, internally and externally too. Now, repaying its debt it owes China, Iran and North Korea for ongoing support. I don't think that there's actually much debt here. This was exchanged for technology and information, whether it be from satellites or whether it be submarine tech, anti-submarine tech, high-efficiency engines, whatever. There's a bit there, but again, pushing China and Russia together long-term, not a great thing. China is incredibly powerful. Finally, losing a negotiation like this to Putin is embarrassing for the strongest country the world has ever seen. Is Washington not clever enough to maneuver Moscow into concessions? But this is one of the things, is either way, losing a negotiation, this is what Mir Sharma talks about, that what Putin will put forward, there's no way an American administration can accept that. Well, he believes there's no way they can accept that. So it's either going to be a loss or the US is going to we need to have Ukraine continue fighting back. But I can see why Russian pages specifically call out articles like this and pieces like this and say, these people want to fight to, quote, the last Ukrainian. And this is it, that nothing is put forward that would be a clear, decisive win, or they never touch on NATO. They never touch on both that what would stop Putin moving forward. Well, it hasn't been said, nor does Russia believe, think they believe they have the conventional power to push through NATO either. It's an incredibly impossible diplomatic decision at the moment that the US is with, and maybe Trump's going, I don't care, I want to look internally and look with it in America's problems, and let's push away this at the moment. Maybe so. Again, we're going to see sooner rather than later. Just because Putin thinks he can win does not mean he can. He was wrong at the start of his special military operation, and he could be wrong now. But the West must be strong enough to prove him wrong. But my question is, what happens if this doesn't work and Putin sort of calls your bluff and you haven't mobilized enough men and the weapons haven't? You can send all the weapons you want, but you still need people trained on how to use those. But what then happens if Putin gets to the Dnipro and lines start crumbling, or lines start crumbling? What then happens then if you've missed that window of negotiating opportunity too? And I think that is what Trump is seeing, that there's a window of this, that the longer this goes on, it can extend the war, but an event horizon of victory has been crossed. Zelensky has never put forward how, he says these grounds will be recaptured diplomatically. He's never said, though, how they could be either. This is further from Lavrov speaking about non-aligned status. Again, what we have said, Russia's one constant has been that Ukraine doesn't join NATO. Ensuring Ukraine's non-aligned status remains the goals of Russia's special military operation. Since NATO's multi-year expansion was one of the main root causes of the Ukrainian crisis, securing Kyiv's non-aligned status remains among the objectives of the special military operation that must be achieved. So they're just ignoring bits in this that are incredibly important to what is occurring and just focusing on, we need more US military aid and these defense companies to make more money by sending it in. That's why people go, these companies and these propagandists and these think tanks, whatever, they're willing to fight to the last Ukraine. And if that's how it goes, no one is giving a clear way on a path to victory. And we have seen that no one's willing to mobilise those men that could potentially turn that either. And then the hardcore supporters, they're not willing, even if they're young, fit guys, they're not willing to go and sign up to fight either. So Slovakia, this is how they see then an end to the war or the future of the war. And this is from the Minister of Defence, Robert Kalinyak. I'm not sure if that is pronounced correctly. Again, this is machine translated, so if there's bits wrong, I then apologise, but he does not understand how the former government could have handed over fighter jets and S-300s to Ukraine. The war in Ukraine through the eyes of himself. According to the Minister of Defence, reality shows that Ukraine will have to give up part of the territory. It is in Slovakia's interest for the war in the country to end immediately and for peace negotiations and a ceasefire to take place between the parties. Saying it is likely that Ukraine does not realise that they will never move between Germany and Switzerland, but will always have its largest border with the Russian Federation. Now, either way this goes, Russia is still going to be on the border. And like, was it Mearsheimer said, but he might, no, not Mearsheimer, Kissinger, maybe he was quoting Churchill that said, Russia is like a tide coming in and out. There is no doubt who the aggressor is here. So he is saying that there's no doubt that Russia is the aggressor because Russia have violated all the rules and international law. But we also need to consider what is happening in other areas and whether we have the same yardstick for other disputes. Are we adding the same laws and considerations on other areas of the world as well as seeing to the reality of what is happening for us? It is of the greatest interest that the war stop immediately and that some peace negotiations, some ceasefire occur in which we can all, of course, participate in some way. But it is important that, above all, people stop dying. Even though the front line is more than 1,000 kilometres away, according to himself, this poses several challenges for our security. Ukraine criticises Poland for not wanting to send its MiG-29 fighters. They are waiting for new ones, which they purchase so that they can have something to use in case of emergency, so a swap of then aircraft. He criticises the former governments for incomprehensibly handing over combat aircraft to Ukraine directly from active service. We handed over combat aircraft, Kaba anti-aircraft systems, S-300 anti-aircraft systems, our helicopters, both combat and transport, without any compensation. And all that actually went along with other ammunition and a lot of other things. Ultimately, it is the SAO that clearly states that this was in a violation of the law and other rules. And our task was to start filling this empty space so that hasn't come back and put Slovakia in a difficult spot as well. What we are seeing is countries like Slovakia and Hungary that they want to seek an end to the war, looking at what they were saying, the reality on the ground, negotiations, and people stop dying, although they are seen now as enemy of the state of Ukraine, and I will go as far as to say as enemies of the EU as well. And how Trump's administration could be seen as an enemy within other NATO countries too. There's going to be a lot of friction in here. Now, of course, we've seen a plane, an Azerbaijani plane, crash in Kazakhstan. We've also seen that horrible crash in South Korea too, killing all but 2 flight staff, I believe, as well for the one in South Korea. But what I want to talk about are false flags, sabotage, potentially what has happened here, and clear up as I see things as well, and talk about what then the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan has said, pointing at Russia. The Prosecutor General's Office of Azerbaijan started a criminal case on my instructions, and I know similar steps were taken both in Kazakhstan and in Russia. Of course, work has begun on initial theories. Of course, the final version will become clear after the black boxes have been examined. Remember, these have not been examined yet. We don't have, beyond reasonable doubt, exactly what has happened. There's still theories, although most likely, 99% positive, sure, it was an AD missile, but not everything, including EW, has been fully seen yet because of the black box, so wait out on any of that, and he says it in this too. The initial theories are also quite reasonable and are based on facts. The facts indicate that Azerbaijani civilian plane was damaged from the outside over Russian territory near the city of Grozny and almost lost control. We also know that means of electronic warfare put the plane out of control. Now, what I've seen a lot of people push back on is electronic warfare will not put the plane out of control. It may destroy instruments and not have those, but as far as putting it in, a flat spin Goose Maverick style, it's not going to do that. You can play with instruments, but it's not going to have a plane fall out of the sky. And what we heard was jamming of GPS. Yes, that can absolutely happen. But again, if it's just that, pilots are trained to fly without that also. The first impact on the plane was, they're saying, the EW. At the same time, as a result of fire from the ground, the tail of the airplane was severely damaged, of course, damaging any of those control surfaces. The fact that the fuselage was riddled with holes indicates the theory of the plane hitting a flock of birds, which was brought up by someone, is completely removed from the agenda. It is possible that when the plane was damaged, it was hit, the pilot could have perceived it as a collision with birds. So maybe it was hit, the pilot thought it was a collision, and maybe it was reported that way. Black box is going to tell us more, because it was probably never have occurred to anyone that our plane might be fired at from the ground while flying over a country friendly to us. However, some circles in Russia preferred to put this forward as theory. Another regrettable and surprising moment for us is that official Russian agencies put forward theories about the explosion of a gas cylinder aboard the plane. In other words, clearly showed that the Russian side wanted to cover up the issue, which of course is unbecoming of anyone. Of course, our plane was hit by accident. So saying that it's so disappointing that official agencies put this forward, that it was maybe an explosion, birds, when it was clearly a missile, but they are saying that it was hit by accident. Of course, there can be no talk of a deliberate act of terror here. Therefore, admitting guilt, apologising in a timely manner to Azerbaijan, which is considered a friendly country, and informing the public about this, these were measures and steps that should have been taken. Unfortunately, for the first 3 days, we heard nothing from Russia except from absurd theories. So some very heavy words from the Azerbaijani leader towards Putin, Kremlin, and Russia. Of course, the details of the incident will be fully investigated. I have no doubt about that. I must note that Azerbaijan was in favour of a group of international experts engaging in this work from the very first day. Russia wanted to do their own, but they said we categorically refused. The reason is clear, because it is no secret that this organisation consists mostly of Russian officials and is headed by Russian citizens. Objectivity factors could not be fully ensured here. If we have seen fair and reasonable steps by Russia in the immediate aftermath of the incident, we probably would not have objected. But we saw the attempts to cover up the case were quite obvious, so the boy who cried wolf, so to speak. Therefore, we expressed this position in our close contacts with both Kazakh side and the Russian side. We're working group of consisting international experts only should be established, and it was. There are representatives for aircraft manufacturer Embraer coming to see what has actually happened here. Let me repeat, after flight recorders have been opened and we have obtained more detailed information, the full picture of what happened will be revealed, and many questions still remaining outside today will be clarified. For example, why couldn't the plane land in Grozny? To what extent was the electronic warfare affecting the plane's controls? What was the extent of the consequences of the strike and the explosion in the vicinity of the plane? I must also state attempts to deny obvious facts and pull the wool over people's eyes here are both nonsensical and absurd. Because fortunately, thanks to the heroism of the crew, an incident occurred that allowed the plane to land, even though it was an emergency landing. Many of the passengers survived, and their testimonials are available, so that helps a hell of a lot. The injuries to the crew and passengers say are from shrapnel. They're saying that is obvious, and saying what Russia said about the gas cylinder is foolish and dishonest. Therefore, we'll try and find out why the plane could not land after the black boxes have been examined. Why couldn't the plane land at the nearest ports, these ones, or why was it not sent to Aktu in the first place? Why was it an objective choice? There are hypotheses around this. Remember, we've seen others say when there's a state of emergency aboard a plane, it is up to the captain for where he lands, not then the ATC on the ground. So potentially what has happened here? Why did that plane then turn? And he goes, some people believe that deliberately sent off course by grounding handling service in Grozny because the plane was already out of control and there's a high probability it would fall into the sea. And if this had been the case, the cover-up attempts would have been successful for the so-called bird theory would be likely, saying that Russia wanted to send them out over the Caspian so it would fall in the ocean, sink to the bottom, and it was birds that hit it, not our own AD. Others are saying that it was chosen because it was located in an open space and residential areas are far away from the airport. The crew of the plane could have assumed that it would be the emergency landing and chose a more suitable place for it. Some are saying there was a few go-arounds on this, but wait out on that. However, nearby airports available, it was riskier for an uncontrolled plane to fly further, especially over the sea. So if you're already out of control, why are you going out over the sea? In other words, there are no answers to all these questions yet. We, the Azerbaijani side, and I personally are trying to be as fair as possible. We do not want to express an opinion on unclear issues before they are fully clarified. So touching on a lot of the points that we have hit as well. Last one from himself. Question is, Mr. President, what are Azerbaijan's expectations and demands from Russia in general in connection to what has happened? We've clearly expressed our demands to the Russian side. Russian side must apologise. Secondly, they must acknowledge its guilt. Thirdly, those responsible must be punished and brought to criminal responsibility, and compensation must be paid to the Azerbaijani state, to the injured passengers and crew members. These are our conditions. The first of these was fulfilled yesterday. I do hope that other conditions will also be accepted. And we saw this then yesterday. This was from the Kremlin, that telephone conversation between Putin and the president of Azerbaijan. And Putin apologised for the fact the tragic incident occurred in Russian airspace. Once again, expressed deep and sincere condolences to the families and the victims of this aircraft. It was strictly on schedule, repeatedly attempted to land at Grozny Airport. At the time, Grozny, Mozdok, and this one here were attacked by Ukrainian UAVs, and Russian air defense systems repelled these attacks. So going into that, there was Ukrainian UAVs in the air, one-way drones. That's why EW was active GPS jamming and why missiles are firing in the air. And I believe this is most likely that missile has then hit it that way. If we apply like Occam's razor, I believe that is the most likely. The Investigative Committee of Russia has opened a criminal case under Article 263 of the Criminal Code, violation of traffic safety rules and operation of air transport. Initial investigative actions are underway. Civilian and military specialists are being questioned about what is actually happening here. But this is something I have seen a hell of a lot. And I pull this one out just because it's the most notable I've seen say, but many, many people are saying this. Several landing gear related incidents occurring in NATO-affiliated countries in the past 24 hours. My money is on the Russians doing it. And many other pro-Ukrainian pages, they're pinning that the Russians are behind not only the plane with the Russian air defense missile hitting it, because, well, yes, that is there likely an accident, but say in Air Canada, in South Korea, that the Russians are behind this as some level of false flag or on purpose. So, look, this is the way I'll do it. When considering false flags, a couple of things you need to ask yourself. Firstly, ask yourself in line when an incident occurs, Occam's razor theory. That is, the simplest explanation requiring the fewest assumptions is usually the best one. It's often used in problem solving and scientific reasoning to choose the most straightforward theory that fits the evidence. So the simplest explanation requiring the fewest assumptions. What is the simplest explanation for this? I do believe that there was an attack, an air defense missile went up, potentially incompetence of those operating it, or then a heat-seeking missile has then hit a civilian plane. It doesn't mean that there wasn't incompetence and massive policy failures that have occurred, but it is simpler to get to that and fewer assumptions there than there is some global international thing going on behind the scenes. But you can see how far some of these posts reach. 10,000 people liked it and over 1.6 million people see it. But that's the first thing you need to take into consideration. The secondly, for false flags or purpose incidents like this, is who stands to benefit from this action. Okay? If something occurs you think looks funky, what's the simplest explanation? But then who benefits from that happening? What benefits Russia from downing or sabotage of these civilian airliners? As far as I can see, this is just all negative because people can paint Russia however they would like because of these incidents. This has not been in Russia's favour at all. It has been the worst thing, or not the worst thing, but very negative for that. So who stands to benefit? Why then would it be done on purpose? Now, statement, I do not believe this, but you could make an argument the other way. But by sabotaging these planes and blaming Russia, that the argument the other way is, could this have been a false flag instigated incident the other way to blame Russia on a false flag? Now, I'm not saying I believe that, but you could make that the other way. And again, that's what I just said, that it could be the other way to, paint that this was Russia. This falls over at step one for the simplest explanation, the fewest assumptions. It falls over there, but it is in line with step two, that it does then be a negative towards Russia. Who stands to benefit? Well, Ukraine go, look at what is happening over here. And we are seeing, of course, Ukraine capitalise on Russia shooting down this plane, capitalise in every way, saying, look at what they do. This is what we're talking about. So falls over step one, but it does ring true on step two. But what I'm saying is you need step 1 and 2 to sort of line up. And using these calculations, I think that most likely this is an accident from air defence. It does not mean that it wasn't caused by incompetence or policy. Now, these several incidents being close together is most likely a coincidence, again, with the simplest explanation requiring the fewest assumptions. Although, with the horror of the plane in South Korea and the flight from Azerbaijan happening with many killed, news will report now on any other plane. So it seems like there is more just because of increased reporting. So if a plane just here in Adelaide had a landing gear failure and blew a tyre, it would be in international news when you would never normally hear about it. You hear about one, then you start hearing about it all because it's trending in the media. That's the way algorithms and clickbaity stuff work, that you hear more when you hear more. Does that make sense? At this point in time, while Russia has the upper hand on the battlefield and the West is somewhat ignoring the shadow fleet, it does not make sense for Russia to escalate or risk a false flag. At this point in time, it doesn't make, in my opinion, the threat of running a false flag, it doesn't make sense for Russia at this point in time. Although the opposite can be said for Ukraine. The risk of false flags is very high for Ukraine losing aid if caught, but the acceptance threshold of this would be much higher for Ukraine than it is for Russia. Of course, we know the false flag of Nord Stream cost billions and billions, being very ignored. Now, this isn't in line with these. I believe this is an accident. I believe there's not a false flag here, but I have been warning for false flags. Now, why do I say at this point in the war, Russian false flags don't seem as likely as Ukrainian false flags? Well, let's go over this and you can make up your opinion. I'm happy to have my opinion changed. So, we have when and why a false flag. So when do you have false flags? For pretext to war, not really that, but rallying domestic support during periods of low public morale or opposition to the war, provoking an enemy reaction, seeking to escalate a conflict to force enemies to making a strategic mistake, gaining international support to secure alliances or military aid, to persuade other nations to support or join the conflict, discrediting internal opposition, diversion from internal problems, sowing discord amongst allies when seeking to weaken alliances to create divisions amongst enemies' allies, peace negotiation tactics when preparing or during peace negotiations, to strengthening one's bargaining position by creating a situation that pressures the enemy to making concessions. So you see here that if you were to tick off then which country has more or less of these, I believe Ukraine would have more of these at the moment if we were to say who is more likely to operate one of these at the time. But like we said in the previous slide, if exposed, false flag operations can severely damage the credibility of the country that carried them out. This goes back into the escalation we talked about, that Putin at the moment is not wanting to escalate, waiting for Trump to come in because that may de-escalate on the other side itself rather than risking more coming in and risking that operation. And like I said in the slide just previously, the threshold for acceptance of false flag from Ukraine is much higher than it is from Russia. Nord Stream, no one said a thing after the initial, we're going to find this is and not stop and blah, blah, blah. As soon as it started going, oh, we know who it is, let's cut that. But something else, like the dam, whatever, then people go on and run with it, fitting certain narratives. So why false flags? Involve manipulating public perception and gaining a strategic advantage. Justification for war or escalation. So absolutely in the beginning, we could have seen more of these. Demonizing the enemy. False flags can be used to portray the enemy as aggressive, dangerous, or inhumane. So again, why this could fit for the operation against planes being the other way. Again, I'm not saying I believe it's the other way, but it does fit the second tier of who stands to benefit from these actions to demonize and dehumanize the Russians. And we see a lot of campaigns, both informational and false flags, to do this also. Diverting attention. False flag might be used to divert attention from other issues such as internal problems, military failures, or unpopular policies. Now, not just false flag, but we're seeing propaganda do this also, provoke a response from the enemy, leading to a justification for a counter-attack. Undermining confidence in the enemy by framing the enemy for a false flag. A country can undermine the enemy's credibility or sow discord amongst its allies. And this is what Russia could do to Ukraine. If they can undermine Ukraine's allies' confidence in them to stop aid, that could be a huge success. That said, I believe no matter what happened there, no matter what Ukraine will do, the support would still be there because people are willing to ignore any war crimes, any whatever, because of where alliances sit. Creating confusion and misinformation. The Kursk war, misinformation can be a powerful tool. False flag attack can create confusion about the true state of the conflict, making it harder for the enemy to respond effectively and for neutral parties to understand the situation. So just muddying the waters. And if you said at the end of 22, who's more likely to have a false flag here, I would have said 100% Russia. At the situation we have on the ground, who is more likely to have a false flag attack here? It is Ukraine. Although we could see if Russia get on the back foot, that's when I'd say we could see a false flag to maybe justify a nuclear attack. And this has always been my concern over, say, when Ukraine was heading up, maybe trying to get to the Kursk power plant, is could Russia blow up the power plant and go, that's a nuclear attack, we're dropping a bomb here. But on the other side, could we see sabotage potentially against the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant by maybe even Ukrainian forces to justify further attacks from NATO into? This is something which, as we get to the point end of the war, look out for. And when we look at those when and why, you can see how this could occur. Now, I'm not saying that plane was. I'm not saying it was. But I'm saying if people are trying to paint it like this, go over these two. That Occam razor theory, what is the simplest explanation, the fewest assumptions, and who stands to benefit from the actions, even if it requires a little bit of mental gymnastics. Nord Stream is a perfect example of this. Who stands to benefit the most from this, and whose threshold of even getting caught but not being worried about is the lowest or highest as well. Legends. Long. I apologise. I knew it was going to be long, but it's Monday. Anyway, Legends, have a great day. Look after yourself, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.